Hello and namaste to all of you. Today in our UPSC GS series, we are doing Sustainable Development Unit 8.1 Environmental Dimensions of Globalization. Unit 8.1 we have already covered in our audio number 24, but few topics are left, and these topics are global environmental interventions, that is globalization and sustainable development, globalization and large scale disruption of the ecosystem, some global environmental initiatives, and summary of the unit 8.1 of sustainable development, that is environmental dimensions of globalization. In this audio number 25, we have to complete the unit 8.1 and begin to unit 8.2 of the sustainable development. General instruction for the students are the same, that they have to listen the audio very carefully and note down 10 words from this audio and think about these words, how they are helpful to live as a sustainable life. Now we are beginning from the point global environmental interventions. Point 4, global environmental interventions. In this section, we shall discuss the ways as to how we can maintain the quality of environment by resorting to sustainable development, minimizing large scale disruption in ecosystem, and by taking global environmental initiatives at large. 4.1, globalization and sustainable development. The last 20 years have seen a virtual explosion of intergovernmental negotiations to formulate international environmental treaties. This ecological globalization is an inevitable result of the ongoing processes of economic growth and economic globalization, which not only stitch the world's economies together but also take national production and consumption levels to a point where there is a threat to the world's ecological systems. The present globalization is driven by the Western economic and technological model, which is highly material and energy intensive. In metabolizes it metabolizes huge quantities of natural resources, leaving a trail of toxins and highly degraded, transformed ecosystems in its wake. It is this very model that the developing nations are following for economic and social growth, leading to an extraordinary combination of poverty and inequality, side by side with growing economies, pollution, and large scale ecological destruction. The process of ecological globalization is driven by the fact that the levels of production and consumption have reached a stage where what one does in one's own country can have a major impact on the neighboring countries or on the rest of the world. Even simple things like using refrigerators or air conditioners can destroy the world's ozone layer, running automobiles or unlimited felling of trees can destabilize the world's climate, and using a persistent organic compound like diphenyl trichloroethane DDT in India can mean life threatening pollution for human beings and other life forms in the remote polar regions of the world, as these compounds are carried to these regions by the world's oceanic currents and air streams. Never was the pace of depletion of resources and emission of harmful gases as high as under the current globalization process. There was never unsustainability of this model of growth as clear as of now. Never before have human beings needed to learn to live in one word as now. 4.2 Globalization and large scale disruption of ecosystems. The World Development Report 2003, World Bank 2003 reports that a global satellite survey estimated a pan-tropical gross deforestation rate of 0.2% annually over 1990 to 2000 or 9.2 million hectares a year in area the size of Portugal. Coral reefs are being lost to bleaching, pollution, and destructive fishing. A worldwide bleaching event in 1998 associated with El Nino harmed 16% of the world's coral reefs, with possibly half damaged irreversibly. Another 32% are thought to be threatened over the next 30 years, and 11% have already been lost. Three quarters of all fish stocks are being exploited at or above their sustainable limits. Total harvests from capture fisheries have leveled off or declined. Some fisheries, such as the Northwest Atlantic cod, have completely collapsed. In others, the depletion of priced predatory fish has led to shifts in ecosystem structure. Almost 15 million square kilometers of ocean bottom have been scrapped by ocean trawlers, possibly causing long-lasting damage to the bottom-dwelling species. For quite some time, poverty was blamed for environmental degradation, but it is increasingly clear that shifting cultivators and small farmers account for only a fraction of depletion of forests or degradation of land. The present phase of globalization shows that large-scale agriculture, including ranches and plantations, and commercial logging account for most of deforestation in Latin America and Asia. Poverty, therefore, is not the immediate driver of most tropical deforestation, but tropical deforestation can exacerbate the poverty of communities dependent on the forest for their livelihood. Similarly, it is greed of mechanist fishing that is causing not only unsustainable exploitation of fish resources but also uprooting the livelihood of millions of traditional fishermen and disrupting the coastal ecosystems. The global disruption of environment manifests in various detrimental ways, of which climate change and ecosystem damage loom large. We have already mentioned the consequences of climate change. Equally grave are the threats posed by ecosystem damage resulting in the loss of biodiversity. The genetic, biophysical, and ecological information embodied in biodiversity may be valuable to future agricultural, pharmaceutical, chemical, material, and information industries. For instance, gene bank collections currently hold 15% or less of the genetic diversity of wide relatives of important crop species, including maize, rice, sorghum, millets, and peas. Loss of some of the remaining 85% might constrain development of improved varieties of these crops. While there is a general agreement that the magnitude of present environmental challenges like climate change or biodiversity are such that these require global cooperation in evolving and implementing rules and methods of mitigation. The recent experience shows that global agreements and their enforcements are effective in areas where the costs are relatively less and the benefits more to the more prosperous countries. Evolving conventions and getting their implementation in several aspects of environmental regulation, which may mean more costs and relatively less tangible immediate gains, especially to the more developed and powerful countries, may not be easy. In the following part, we shall examine some of the initiatives in mitigating the global environmental problems. 4.3 Some global environmental initiatives. One of the successful global initiatives to reserve the adverse impact of modern development on environment relates to ozone layer. By late 1970s, it was clear that CFCs were causing depletion of ozone layer, which in turn was resulting in an increased ultraviolet radiation causing skin cancers. International action on the ozone layer was taken when the following United Nations Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer in Vienna in 1985. Shortly thereafter, dramatic satellite images of the Antarctic ozone hole captured public attention. This deepening evidence prompted the Montreal Protocol of 1987 and outgrowth of the Vienna Convention to impose obligations on the developed countries to reduce the use of ozone depleting substances. On further evidence of causal impact of CFCs on ozone in 1990, the London Protocol to the Vienna Convention took effect and it was agreed upon to cut the CFC levels by 85% by 1997. Under this protocol, developing countries agreed to take on obligations with a grace period and developed countries underwrote a trust fund of $240 million to assist them. The result is a foreseeable reduction in atmospheric concentrations of ozone depleting substances and an eventual recovery of the ozone layer. The problem of protecting the global ozone layer was easier to tackle than other global environmental problems like climate change and biodiversity erosion. The political economy of reaching agreement on ozone layer was favorable at the national level. The wealthy industrial nations responsible for most production were also those at the greatest risk from skin cancer. Further, production and use of ozone depleting substances is not central to any economy, unlike greenhouse gases, whose production is deeply embedded in the energy and transport sectors. El Nino. El Nino is a disruption of ocean atmosphere system in the tropical Pacific having important consequences for weather around the globe. The name was originally given by Peruvian fishermen to a warm current that appeared each year around Christmas, and gradually the usage of the term changed to refer only to the irregular strong ever. During El Nino, the high winds relax in the central and western Pacific, leading to a depression of the thermocline in the eastern Pacific and an elevation of the thermocline in the west. The observations at 110 watts show, for example, that during 1980 to 1983, the 17-degree isotherm dropped to about 150-meter depth. This reduced the efficiency of upwelling to cool the surface and cut off the supply of nutrient-rich thermocline water to the euphotic zone. The result was a rise in sea surface temperature and a drastic decline in primary productivity, the latter of which adversely affected higher trophic levels of the food chain. including commercial fisheries in this region. Rainfall follows the warm water eastward with associated flooding in Peru and drought in Indonesia and Australia. The eastward displacement of the atmospheric heat source overlaying the warmest water results in large changes in the global atmospheric circulation, which in turn force changes in weather in the regions far removed from the tropical Pacific. Socio-economic effects of the 1997-98 El Nino. The 1997-98 El Nino event affected virtually every region. Eastern Africa, Eastern Africa suffered drought and unusually high rainfall. Southeast Asia and North America abnormally warm periods. South Asia drought, Latin America and the Caribbean unusually high rainfall and drought, and the Pacific islands unusually high rainfall. The global socio-economic impacts were varied. More than 24,000 people died because of high winds, floods, or storm tides that occurred during the intense storms. More than 110 million people were affected and more than 6 million people were displaced as community infrastructures, including housing, food storage, transport, and communications, were lost during storms. Direct economic losses exceeded US $34 billion. Waterlogging of fields reduced agricultural production in many regions. In others, the absence of storms and rain led to prolonged dry spells, loss of crops, and reduction in water supplies. Wildfires were more frequent and widespread during extended dry periods. Increased incidence of disease followed the prolonged disruption to weather and rainfall patterns that resulted in contamination of water supplies or a more favorable environment for disease carrying insect vectors. El Nino and epidemic diseases. Cyclical temperature and rainfall variations associated with El Nino are particularly important since they can favor the development and proliferation of vectors of epidemic diseases such as malaria, dengue fever, yellow fever, and bubonic plague WHO 1999. In South America, the most severe outbreaks of malaria generally increase in rainfall, as in 1983 in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, or with a reduction in rainfall and runoff, as in Colombia and Venezuela. A similar link has been suggested between the warming of superficial oceanic waters by El Nino, the proliferation of marine algae, and the appearance of cholera in South America in 1992. The impact of extremes in the precipitation, both too much and too little, is also important in the transmission of waterborne diseases such as cholera, gastrointestinal infections, and various types of diarrhea. There are outbreaks of cholera in 1997-98 in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Peru related to the increase in precipitation associated with El Nino, WHO 99, PAHO 1998. The most widely used scale to measure the intensity of the El Nino is known as the Southern Oscillation Index SOI, which is based on the surface atmospheric pressure difference various regions. In spite of a number of hurdles, the United Nations has been in the forefront in taking initiatives to mitigate the global environmental problems, which are likely to exacerbate if the present trend of the Economic globalization continues unabated. A major UN initiative came after the UN Conference on the Human Environment (UNCHE) in 1972 at Stockholm. The United Nations Environmental Programme (UNEP) was created in 1972 to provide leadership and encourage partnership in caring for the environment by inspiring, informing and enabling nations and peoples to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. The UNEP initiative, however, remained dormant for almost 2 decades until early 1990s. There was growing concern about global warming. Under global pressure, the UN Convention on climate change was adopted in 1992. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was signed, which called for industrial countries to reduce emissions by 5.2% compared to 1990 levels by 2008 to 2012. But the US, which is responsible for one-fourth of the world's total carbon emission, refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol on the ground that developing countries were exempted. The developing countries, on the other hand, demand polluting north to pay costs and transfer resources to compensate for the loss suffered by them. The Carbon Convention is a positive step in this direction. The UN Conference on Environment and Development (UNCED) held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 is seen as a landmark in evolving a blueprint for the 21st century. The Commission for Sustainable Development (CSD) was established in 1992, though Global Environmental Facility (GEF) was established in 1991. It was restructured in 1994 in the light of developments and conventions since the Rio Conference, recognizing the importance of biodiversity for the survival of life, including human life on the earth, and sharing concern over loss of biodiversity by unprecedented levels since 1980s. The Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD) was convened in 1992, and among other things, it reaffirmed sovereign rights of states over their natural resources and agreed to establish a fund through GEF to pay for the use of genetic resources of developing countries. Unlike the initiative on ozone layer, the progress on other major environmental issues like climate change and biodiversity is very tardy. What appears to be apparent is that while economic globalization appears to be increasingly embedded in strong institutional support systems, ecological globalization, seen in terms of challenges to sustainable development, is still in search of empowered institutional support. At least two shortcomings are discernible. Firstly, the process of global environmental threat is not accompanied by any strong political support. As a result, no political leader has any interest to ensure that the emerging global ecological policy is managed in the best interest of the maximum number of people and on the basis of the principles of good governance, that is, equality, justice, and democracy. Secondly, there is no clear and transparent mechanism to integrate the two processes of economic and ecological globalization, but nations are doing so individually, often in a convert manner, through the positions they take to set the rules for the two processes of globalization. When the leaders of nation states meet to develop rules and regulations for economic globalization, they take positions to derive the maximum economic benefits for their national economies. When they meet to develop the rules and regulations for ecological globalization, they take positions which ensure that there would be either no costs or at worst least possible costs to their individual national economies. As a result of these two shortcomings, the rules and regulations that are emerging generally tend to be based on the principles of business transactions rather than on the principles of good governance. Environmental diplomacy has turned into petty business transactions, not the establishment of fair and just global environmental governance systems. While business transactions are built on principles of mutual benefits regardless of their societal costs, governance systems are built on principles of democracy, justice, and equality. The issue of equity has become a very contentious one in environmental diplomacy. Equity is a prerequisite for global agreement, and environmental cooperation can only be possible through solutions that are both equitous and ecologically effective. Without equity or a sense of fair play, it is quite unlikely that there will be a long lasting partnership to address and solve global problems. Global equity is particularly important in global environmental negotiations which deal with the pollution or degradation of global common property, such as the stratospheric ozone layer, the atmosphere, or oceans. So far, these common property resources are seen as free access resources, a situation that aided the industrialization process of early entrants. In the context of globalization, environmental concerns have not yet found an institution which is as powerful as World Trade Organization (WTO) in the arena of global trade. A widely shared feeling is that while WTO managing world trade has become stronger, environmental institutions have become weaker in the years following the Rio conference. World leaders are yet to design a unifying institutional framework for the global environment. The need of the hour is to rectifying this institutional deficiency in the interest of sustainability of diversity of life on the planet and to evolve an environmental organization as effective, if not more than effective, as WTO. The driving forces behind the present globalization process are the corporate capitalist interest in pursuit of larger and faster profits. The imprint of corporate capitalism is clear in the emergence of global institutions like the WTO. One of the elements of resistance to corporate globalization could be seen in the form of growing environmental movements. The emergence and effectiveness of a world environmental organization would depend upon the power of public mobilization against the adverse environmental impact of the present globalization. Summary of the whole unit 8.1 of sustainable development. Let us summarize what we have studied so far. Beginning with the early 1980s, the world has been experiencing unprecedented pace in the expansion of global trade, financial flows, and spread of transnational production. This process has come to be widely known as globalization. It is aided by the revolution in information and communication technology (ICT), which has compressed time and space. While these rapid changes are seen as necessary to sustain fast growth, there are also concerns that the globalization process, by hastening resource exploitation and by increasing industrial activity, especially in the energy and transport sectors, has been causing considerable damage to environment. The environmental impact has been assuming global proportions in the form of emission of GHGs, causing global warming or climate change and biodiversity degradation besides unsustainable depletion of resources. The free trade and investment flows which drive the globalization process are also seen as an environmentally harmful. The proposition of developed countries to contain these adverse effects through environmental standards in terms of trade restrictions are resisted by developing countries. the latter see them as restrictions on their trading prospects. There is a growing consensus that the emerging environmental problems need global initiatives with the participation of developing as well as developed countries. At the behest of the UN, a number of initiatives have been made for restricting and reversing environmental damage. Some of the initiatives, like the Vienna Convention and the protocol that followed on CFC's control and ozone layer, have been very successful, but other initiatives, like the one on climate change, are facing resistance. There is a growing feeling among many observers that to face the environmental challenges which are deepened by the present globalization process, there is a need for a multinational world environmental organizations WEO, which should function as effectively on environmental issues as the WTO does in the arena of trade. Glossary: Biodiversity means biodiversity is a variety and variability among living organisms and the ecological complexes in which they occur. The term is helpful for reminding us that it is not just the total stock of living things that matters, but the range of different living things. Diversity of living things is essential for survival of a species. Population growth, market driven exploitation of resources, wrong planning, and government failure have been the cause of loss of biodiversity. Protecting world's biodiversity is a difficult but an essential task. Brundtland hypothesis. Brundtland hypothesis is about the link between the terms of trade and the environment. If the terms of trade decline, exporting countries must export more and more just to maintain foreign exchange earning constant. The pressure on export more primary commodities may lead to degradation of resources. Environmental standards. Environmental standards refer to restrictions on trade in commodities which are not subject to certain environmentally damaging limits in their production or exploitation. Global change or global climate change or global warming GHGs refer to climate change caused by global warming as a result of increase in greenhouse gases. Global commons, the atmosphere and oceans beyond the exclusive economic zones surrounding national land masses. These are global commons because they are owned by the world at large. Greenhouse effect. Greenhouse effect is a process in which energy from the sun passes through the atmosphere freely, but the heat radiated back from the earth is partially absorbed by the GHGs. The increase in GHGs causes global warming. Greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs are the main GHGs. Sustainable development: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Ozone layer: a layer of stratospheric ozone. Ozone layer blocks ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Depletion of the ozone layer increases the incoming ultraviolet radiation. Unit 8.2: Environmental calamities. In this unit, we will do number 1 introduction, that is aims and objectives. Point 2 natural calamities. Point 3 earthquakes. Point 4 floods. Point 5 droughts. Point 6 cyclones. Point 7 tsunamis. Point 8 hurricanes. Point 9 volcanoes. Point 10. Point 10 preparation and management of calamities, and at the last summary. Point 1 introduction. In the previous unit, unit 8.1 of sustainable development, we have covered we have studied about the dimension of globalization and its impact on the environment. In the present unit, we shall discuss about environmental calamities that may often set in deluge and cause immense loss to our nation in terms of loss of life and destruction of natural bounties. We often use the words catastrophe, catastrophe, cataclysm, cataclysm, calamity, and disaster to refer to personal and public misfortunes that result in grave loss of properties and or heavy casualties. Though the dictionary meanings may seem synonymous, there are qualitative and quantitative differences in the extent of damage to life, property, and the well being of biotic and abiotic entities, as well as in the range of the effects on a time scale, much before man woke up to the effects of globalization. Calamities like floods, earthquakes, eruption of volcanoes, and forest fires were wreaking havoc on human lives. But with rapid industrialization, exploitation of non-renewable natural resources, construction of huge dams, deforestation, indiscriminate use of chemicals, and man in his greed for quick returns with lower inputs contributed to the escalation of the occurrence of these calamities. This coupled with the man-made disasters like nuclear accidents, industrial accidents, disposal of toxic waste, accidents in the transportation of hazardous wastes, oil spills, and emission of greenhouse gases has created a situation that threatens the existence of humanity. There are sections of scientists and social scientists who argue that all environmental calamities are man-made disasters, whereas others argue that development and economic growth cannot be achieved unless we take calculated risks. These issues are debatable, but the issue at stake is the survival of humanity. It is to be acknowledged that the margin between natural calamities and man-made disasters is becoming thinner gradually. Aims and objectives. After studying this unit, we will be able to define environmental calamities and classify them, discuss the impact of environmental calamities on society, and identify the need for preparedness to reduce and meet the eventuality eventualities eventualities and their adverse effects. Natural calamities. According to the World Health Organization, an environmental calamity is an event that causes damage, economic disruption, loss of human life, and deterioration in the health and health services on the scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside that affected community or area. Natural calamities adversely affect the lives of a large number of people and cause considerable damage to infrastructure and property. The ill effects are more pronounced and in developing countries due to the lack of preparedness, lack of sufficient warning system, and lack of facilities for quick access to the site of calamity. At the global level, Asia is more prone to natural calamities. It is reported that for each major natural calamity in Europe and Australia, there are 10 in Latin America and Africa and 15 in Asia. According to CRED World Disaster Report 1998, the ratio of those killed to those affected depends on the type of calamity, degree of preparedness, and the density of population. For example, while floods affect many but relatively less number is killed, whereas in earthquake many lives are lost but relatively less number is affected. The following table gives the annual average number of people killed or affected by the 10 years 1987 to 1996 in the South Asia country Bangladesh. People killed approximate 44,000. People affected approximate 18 18 lakhs 18,574,000. Country India. People killed 5,063. People affected approximate 56,563,000. Country Nepal. People killed 780. People affected approximate 201,000. Country Pakistan. People killed 750. People affected 1,407,000. Country Sri Lanka. People killed 100. People affected approximate 504,300. Country Bhutan. People killed 5. People affected approximate 7,000. Country Maldives. People killed 1. People affected approximate 30. Source correct World Disaster Report 1998. Natural calamities could be broadly classified under the following headings. Number first, atmospheric. Rains, hailstorms, winds, lightning, fog, heat, cold, waves, etc. Hydrologic. Floods, seashore, waves, glacier, advances, waterlogging, etc. Geologic. Landslides, avalanches, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, shifting sands, etc. Biologic. Severe epidemics in human, plants, animals, forest fires, pest invasions, locusts, etc. Selected natural disasters, Asia and the Pacific. July 1976, an earthquake in China took 242,000 lives. April 1991, a cyclone in Bangladesh accompanied by a storm surge caused 138,866 deaths. February 1990 and December 1991, cyclones in Samoa caused losses of $450 million, about 4 times the country's GDP. January 1995, the earthquake in Kobe, Japan became one of the costliest natural disasters in history. 5,502 people were killed and more than 1,800,000 affected, with damage estimated at $131.5 billion. October 1999, the super cyclone in the eastern state of Odisha in India caused more than 10,000 deaths, while 15 million people were rendered homeless, left without food, shelter or water, and their livestock population devastated. The cyclone damaged 1.8 million hectares of agricultural land and uprooted more than 90 million trees. January 2001, an earthquake of magnitude 7.7 on the Richter scale rocked the state of Gujarat in India, causing more than 20,000 deaths and 167,000 injuries. Economic losses estimated at $2.1 billion. Recent disasters caused by extreme natural events around the world. The year 2000. Mongolian herders had their hardest winter for 30 years. 2.4 million livestock died and 45% of the country's population was affected. In February and March, floods killed 650 people and left more than half a million homeless in Mozambique. Heavy rains also affected Botswana, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe. Cyclones Elaine mid-February and Gloria early March left 184,000 people in need of immediate relief support out of the total of 737,000 affected in Madagascar. In early April, a third cyclone Huda hit the north of the island. Floods in September and October in Southeast Asia, especially Vietnam and Thailand, killed approximately 900 people and left 4 million homeless or with insufficient shelter, losses estimated at US dollars 460 million. Hurricane Keith in October killed 8 and affected 62,000 people in Belize. Direct losses estimated at US dollar 520 million. In mid-October, heavy rains caused floods in the Italian and Swiss Alps, killing 38 people and causing economic losses estimated at US dollar 8.5 billion. Similar floods killed 6 people and caused US dollar 1.5 billion loss in the United Kingdom in November. The year 2001, the mid to late January, heavy rains over Zambezia province caused the Likungo River to flood in Mozambique. Nearly 500,000 people were affected by the floods. In March, floods devastated a wide area of northeastern Hungary, northwestern Romania, and western Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people were forced to move. Flash floods unexpectedly, flash floods unexpectedly struck parts of Pakistan on 23 July. The cities of Islamabad and Rawalpindi were the worst affected. 132 people were killed. In mid-November, as many as 576 Vietnamese had been killed by natural disasters, mainly floods and typhoons. Material losses amounted to more than US dollar 200 million. A persistent multi-year drought in Central and Southwest Asia had affected about 60 million people by November 2001. After several months of drought, devastating floods tore through the Algerian capital Algiers on 10 November, killed 751 people. Thousands were injured and about 40,000 people were left homeless. Any one of the combination of several of the above mentioned calamities may result in famine or drought. There have been arguments that famines and droughts are entirely man-made and could not be termed as natural calamities. But famines and droughts had been there even before the present appearance of globalization or massive industrialization. The following table gives the annual average number of people killed due to disasters during the period 1970 to 1996. Period: earthquake, famine or drought, floods, high winds, landslides, volcano eruption. Total. Period 1972 to 1976. Earthquake 64,170. Famine or drought 253,800. Floods 7,232. High winds 4,877. Landslides 1,142. Volcano eruption 9. Total 331,330. 1977 to 1981. Earthquake 5,821. Famine drought 56. Floods 4,900. High winds 6,729. Landslides 343. Volcano eruption 129. Total 17,979. Period 1982 1986. Earthquake 3,210. Famine drought 111,832. Floods 4,269. High winds 6,494. Landslides 488. Volcano eruption 4,740. total 131,033. Period 1987 to 1991, earthquake 15,548, famine drought 1,852, floods 39,787, high winds 57,803, landslides 1,184, volcano eruption 151, total 116,325. Period 1992-1996, earthquake 4,826, famine drought 489, floods 7,293, high winds 3,797, landslides 807, volcano eruption 56, total 17,268. 1972 to 1996, earthquake 18,715, famine droughts 73,606, floods 12,696, high winds 15,960, landslides 793, volcano eruption 1,017, total 122,787. This is the average of 1972 to 1996. There is no discernible trend in the number of deaths due to one type of calamity or the other. Famine was the biggest killer in the early in the 70s, but the situation has considerably improved over the years. Improved preparedness, building up of buffer stock of food grains, early response to mitigating the sufferings of people could be attributed to the lower death toll in recent years. Point 3. Earthquakes. Next point we will cover in our next audio.